All all right, so I think we are ready to start. And as I say, I'm going to continue with the topics we were covering last week, and I want to jump right in. I want to suggest, right, that the policies that Donald Trump has succeeded in getting passed, either through legislation or through executive action, in the first 6 months of his second term are some of the most consequential and transformative economic policies of the last, and here I guess I want to go back to FDR, right, of nearly the last 100 years. And that they are also, I think, quite likely to be economically destructive. And so one way to express this, and I'm going to move to the slide that I showed you last time and got a little bit more analysis of this time, is to say, right, that we're beginning to see, and the way that the head of the Yale Budget Lab put it recently, is increasing stagflationary signals in the economy, right? And so what does that mean? Well, it means that there are signs that the economy is moving in the direction of a recession. One way to express this is if you were to subtract the economic activity associated with artificial intelligence from this economy, you would we would probably already be in a recession. Another way to put this is, right, the job numbers from averaging around 200,000 jobs being created per month for the previous 2 years have gone down to around 50,000 jobs being created per month in the first 6 months of the Trump administration. And if you were to subtract jobs being created in education and especially health services from these numbers, the numbers would actually be negative. We'd be losing around 50,000 jobs a month. So some serious signs that there are growing concerns or effects from this economic policy. Growth is slowing, job creation has fallen, inflation is rising. And I want to just dwell on this for a moment, and I'll say more about it in a few minutes. But again, that the head of the Yale Budget Lab says that the tariff policies are the single most inflationary job policies. I'm sorry, inflationary policies that the government has passed in generations, right? And please note, right, that what she means when she says that is that we've gone from a 2.5 on average tariff rate for the rest of the world to a nearly 20% tariff rate for the rest of the world. This is, to be as clear as possible, 7 to 8 fold increase. And the tariffs are taxes. They're taxes on imports that the margins that companies operate with do not allow them to simply swallow a increase in the tune of 7 to 8 times the amount of tax being imposed forever. They're going to pass it along to consumers. We're beginning to see, right, inflation come back. We had hoped that it was just going to keep going all the way down to 2%. Instead, it's starting to go up again. So you put, right, inflation, job growth slowing, right, and the economy as a whole seeming to be in a less strong position than we were in before. And you may wonder, well, what the hell is going on with with the stock market then? And very quickly, this is where if you subtract, right, AI stocks from the stock market actually isn't doing so great. Please note, right, the green line here shows you the overall economic indicators of the health of the American economy, and the blue line shows you the S&P 500. And so there's a big gap between how other economic indicators indicate the economy is doing and how the stock market is doing. And I want to be as clear as possible. The stock market is not an economic indicator. It doesn't tell us how the economy is doing. It's a bet on profitability of companies in the future. And the big bet right now is that AI is going to pay off. This is what is driving domestic investment, right, in fixed income. It's really going into data centers. And so two things worth emphasizing here, right? The first is sometimes our bets are wrong. And so the dot-com bubble and bust of the early 2000s is the last time I think we had this much excitement about a technology. And it turned out to be too much hype, too little productivity gain, right? And so there's a possibility that AI may be overhyped. And on the other hand, there's a possibility that it really is going to be a powerfully transformative technology. But then one of the things we have to ask is what kinds of transformation is it going to bring about? And one of the things that is said about AI by its advocates is that this is the first time we've created a technology that doesn't allow human tools to operate more efficiently or to replace inefficient tools, right? The horse-drawn plow with efficient tools, the combine tractor, as opposed to that this is a tool that allows us to replace humans. Just think about that for a second, right? Part of what AI allows you to do is replace your executive assistant with an AI assistant. And AI is a lot cheaper than your human labor in the same way that robotics are a lot cheaper than your former labor-intensive system of employment. And so if the bet on AI is not a bubble, if it really is going to increase productivity and pay out, it may create a secondary crisis, an employment crisis. I've spoken with you about this relatively recently. There are some signs already that certain sectors of the labor market are depressed or not growing, in part because AI is taking those jobs. If AI really pans out over the next couple of years, we may have real tumult in the job market. So this is all review, right? This is setting up what I want to talk with you about today. The stagflationary signals. Growth is slower than it was predicted to be. Inflation is higher than it was predicted to be. It appears that there are growing costs on the part of companies and their inventory that they're acquiring eventually to sell, and that those costs have not yet really been passed along to consumers, but they will be, so there's likely to be more inflation. I don't want to focus exclusively on the economic picture. I want to move from the economic to the political picture, right? Which is in the title, right? The revolution is taking hold. The consequence is likely to be economic difficulties for all of us. And in particular, and this goes back to the problem with economic policy that is premised on so much confusion, so many mistakes, that the consequence is going to be more or less the opposite of what the intention is. Slower growth, higher inflation, and especially greater inequality. And the worry I have is as much political as economic. I certainly don't want to see stagflation or a recession or rising inequality. But if the Trump administration and if Donald Trump himself seems almost dispositionally incapable of changing course. And there's one situation in which I guess that might not be true, and that would be if the bond market really began to shudder, really began to say, we no longer think the United States can pay its debt to the world, and therefore the interest rates are going to go up, and therefore a downward spiral begins in which we have to pay more interest on the debt we're issuing in order to pay off our old debt. Um, I think that there's a chance Donald Trump might reverse course. But if it's just that we're experiencing inflation and a slowing economy and rising inequality all at the same time, Donald Trump seems to believe his core convictions. Tariffs allow him to exercise greater power and take advantage of the United States' great economic power in bullying the rest of the world to give us favorable trade relations as opposed to the disfavorable trade relations that we've accepted for a long time, that his view of the economy gets us back to manufacturing, and manufacturing will be good for the American worker, and that what we're experiencing right now is just short-term pain that will be worth it in the long term, and that once we make it through the pain, Donald Trump will be regarded as the savior of the American economy. I think he's really convinced of these ideas. I think they're deeply confused. I think unless the bond market convinces him to change course, he's going to stick the course, stay with it. And then, right, what does he do politically? And that's where I'm deeply concerned that the likely uh, consequence of growing economic discontent with Donald Trump's policies' impact on our economy is that Donald Trump will try to game our political system, will try to increase the use of coercive power to disorganize the opposition and suppress their vote, and that his other deep conviction that in the 21st century, successful political leadership is strongman leadership, and again uses the power of the state to accomplish the goals of the leader, that this may bring out his authoritarian or autocratic tendencies, and that we will be then in the pitched battle for the future of democracy that many of us have been concerned is the likely upshot of this administration, more quickly and more dangerously as a result of these economic policies. So I hope you're with me. The economic policies are slowing growth, slowing job creation, creating inflation, and perhaps creating the preconditions for a stock market correction. And that is all by itself bad, but in addition to that, likely to increase inequality as well. That this is where the majority of the economic signals are pointing, and that, by the way, Donald Trump's preferred policy here is therefore to try to change the signals as opposed to change the course or change the reality. And so we're getting Stephen Moran appointed to the Federal Reserve. We're getting E.J. Antoni appointed to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I don't think the Bureau of Labor Statistics is going to be fundamentally damaged by the appointment of somebody who is clearly not competent or qualified to do the job. That sounds like a peculiar thing to say, but note that he's the one political appointee in an agency that has 2,000 employees. And frankly, the metaphor I've heard recently, he's like the guy who opens the envelope at the Academy Award. He didn't actually produce the results, he just reads them. And so Having said that, right, the effort to manipulate the data or to change the underlying reality, perhaps by bullying the Federal Reserve into doing something that otherwise it wouldn't do because it's against the judgment of the majority of the highly qualified economists who set our central bank interest rate policy. These products, the product of these efforts are likely not only not to do what Donald Trump wants them to do, to get people to believe that the economy is doing better, or to actually make the economy do better, or to soften the short-term pain of the transition we're going through to a world where manufacturing comes back, as opposed to that, right? If these policies erode the confidence of the rest of the world in either the reliability of economic data in the United States or the sanity of economic policy making in the United States, it's going to make it harder for us to finance our debt. It's going to cause interest rates in the long term to go up, right? And it's going to therefore worsen the problem. The economy is not easily bullied. And in the long term, although you can spin people's perceptions of the economy, the vibe economy is ultimately returned to the reality of the underlying economic forces, as Adam Smith put it, by a kind of gravitational force, right? The idea that Donald Trump is, right, not ultimately going to succeed in showing new charts and changing the economy as a result is part of my supposition here. The idea that, yes, there's a lot of partisanship in the perception of the well-being of the economy, but ultimately it's also dictated by what's happening in the economy. If you lose your job on Monday and on Tuesday, right, you're worried about how you pay the rent, how you feed your children, how you afford the medical care, the insurance for which you just lost, and you turn on Fox News to distract yourself, and they tell you the economy's doing great. It's not going to solve your problems, right? Those problems are grounded in deeper economic reality. Now, I want to return to these diagrams just for a moment, because now getting more deeply into tariffs, and then I want to get into the big beautiful bill, and then I want to get into deportation. So I got territory to cover with you. But I noticed something more about this. I presented this to you last week, but in doing the research for today's lecture and thinking more about this topic, I noticed something very interesting, right? Tariffs have gone up, right? Revenue from tariffs have gone up in the last 3 months, for which we have data, by almost 3 times the average from the previous 4 years. $30 billion as opposed to $10 billion would be the rough math here, right? And, right, imports are going down. But wait a sec, look at how much imports are going down by, right? And if you draw the line, they're just a little bit below the average, maybe 5%, I'm guesstimating, below the average of the previous 2 years. So what this tells me, and it's what a lot of economists have predicted and expected, is that the tariffs are not going to drive imports down proportionately, right? They may drive them down a little bit because, frankly, iPhones are made in China and elsewhere in the world. Automobile parts are made all over the world. Furniture, clothing, etc., made in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in Malaysia, and frankly, you can't flip a switch and start making them in the United States. And so, as opposed to right? The consequence of the tariffs being that we're going to import less, at least for the time being, the consequence of the tariff seems to be we're going to import about the same amount, we're just going to pay more for it, right? And then let me just ask the question. Let's assume that the tariffs are upheld by the Supreme Court ultimately. It wouldn't surprise me, even though on their face they don't seem to fit the IEPA model of what the legislation allows, right? I mean, again, right, the argument here is that the trade deficits we're running are so extreme, they represent an emergency. The problem is those trade deficits have been around for 40 years. Why is there an emergency in 2025? Oh, and then by the way, we're imposing a tariff of 50% on Brazil, and we run a surplus with Brazil. So if the rationale is, right, there's an emergency caused by trade deficit, why are we targeting Brazil? And that betrays the fact that the reason we're using tariffs is that Donald Trump likes exercising power. He likes to be able to say, you're fired, you're tariffed, you do what I want you to do, or else I will do something punishing to you. You please me or suffer the consequences. Tariffs allow him to do this in his second term presidency. The problem is that's not what the legislation, on the basis of whose authority he's making these impositions, these maneuvers, allows him to do. But let's assume he is allowed to do it. I think, frankly, the jobs are not coming back. The manufacturing is not coming back. And so I'll get into that argument in just a moment because I think it matters. But first, let's just notice, right? We are reliant on cheap, imported, manufactured goods to compensate for the fact that we have an affordability crisis on a whole bunch of other goods, that our wages are stagnant. And when you increase tariffs, you increase prices, this is going to exacerbate the affordability crisis that seems to be the root cause of so much anger and resentment in our economy. It's going to worsen inflation. It's going to shrink economic growth. That seems to be the effect. The result is going to be that every family in the United States will have less money to spend, that proportionately this is going to impact the poorest families the worst because they are going to sacrifice a higher proportion of their disposable income to purchase now more expensive goods. That the problem here is that the underlying theory is built on a series of mistakes and confusions. And I want to go a little bit more detail in this today. The theory is that America has lost manufacturing jobs. That much is abundantly, indisputably clear. That over the same period that we've lost manufacturing jobs, we've become a much more unequal society, and the people who are no longer getting manufacturing jobs, those who have a high school education or less, have become much more economically precarious. Again, I think that is indisputable, abundantly clear, that the solution to the problem is therefore tariffing goods that are being imported into the United States but manufactured elsewhere, and that the consequence of the tariffs is that manufacturing jobs will come back to the United States, that they will be as good as the jobs that we lost, and that the result will be that people with less education will get good wages, good jobs again. That doesn't make sense. It's a nice story to tell on the campaign trail, but when it is the premise of an economic policy that fundamentally alters the terms of the economy, and it's based on utter confusion. We are in for a rough ride. So, why do I say it's based on fundamental confusion? I'll be direct but brief about this. This is a kind of magnified indication of the decline of manufacturing jobs, focusing just on manufacturing jobs. Okay, in the 1940s, they were more than a third of the jobs in the United States, but that's in part due to the war effort. When they stabilized in the 1960s, there are a little bit over 25% of the jobs in the United States. Today, they're fewer than 10% of the jobs. So we've seen a decline of roughly 20% of the jobs in manufacturing in our economy. If we look at it in terms of value instead of percentage of jobs. And I should note, I'm relying very much on a series of articles Paul Krugman has written recently on inequality. The idea that the value of manufacturing for the overall economy used to be 25%. Now it's down to around 10%, so a 15% decline. And the idea that in the 1970s, 1980s, this is the trade deficit, right? How many manufactured goods were we selling to the rest of the world, minus how many manufactured goods were we buying from the rest of the world. It went up and down, but the average was that we had no trade deficit, that we were basically selling to the rest of the world equivalent to what we were buying from the rest of the world. That changed in the 1980s. As you can see, it went down precipitously, it came back, but then it went down deeply again, and it stabilized at about 4% fewer goods being sold to the rest of the world than we buy from the rest of the world, right? And so a decline of about 4%. Now notice, right, that what we're trying to account for is a decline of 20% or 15%. The explanation cannot be, I think just mathematically it's quite clear, and then we get into what's actually happening in manufacturing, it becomes abundantly clear that the reliance on cheap imported goods is only a small part of the story. What makes up the rest of the story? Well, this diagram, which has nothing to do with manufacturing, I think helps us to focus on the right issue. This is percentage of agricultural employment in the United States. Who works on farms, right? And in 1860, it was 50% of our population. Every other person worked on a farm. Today, 2.5% of our population, a radical decline. And if I ask you, is this because we're importing a lot more agriculture than we export, or that we no longer make our own food? I think you know very quickly that the answer is, well, that's not the major explanation. The major explanation is that in 1860, the way we were farming was using horse-drawn plows and hand-spreaded sowing of seeds. And now we use massive diesel-powered combines in agribusiness. We've seen huge productivity gains, and the result is that we need about 1/50th of the labor to generate even greater agricultural productivity. And then the same thing applies to manufacturing. And this leads to what Krugman calls the good jobs fallacy, the idea that manufacturing jobs are great jobs, and if we could only bring them back, we would have the kind of economy we had in the middle of the 20th century. And the problem is that manufacturing jobs have also seen massive productivity gains. That the Ford Motor Company used to employ 100 people on the assembly line that cranked out cars. They now employ 10 people on that same assembly line, and that assembly line actually cranks out cars more quickly. What's happened? Robotics, automation. new techniques of production, including globalization, but not simply, right, the fact that we are importing cars, but that we're letting companies that are better, I'm sorry, countries that are better at manufacturing ball bearings manufacture the ball bearings for us. We're not making all the components. The result is we're much more efficient at making cars, and that means two things, right? The first is that tariffs are not pixie dust. They're not going to bring manufacturing jobs back because the countries that are better at making iPhones, that are better at making ball bearings, that are better at making jet plane engine components, right? They're going to continue to have that comparative advantage. We're just going to pay more for the goods we import, not start making our own goods. We can't do it all. Our labor is too expensive. It's not skilled enough. We've specialized in other things. There are a number of reasons why we can't just get the jobs back. But let's entertain the fantasy for a moment that all those jobs, I'm sorry, all the manufacturing comes back, right? We go to a world where there is no manufacturing trade deficit. Let's make a very generous assumption that manufacturing workers make roughly 13% more than comparable workers in other sectors, right? So if you've got only a high school education and you're working for the Ford Motor Company, you're making 13% more than you're making at Walmart's or Starbucks or as an Uber driver. And then again, the generous assumption that we somehow bring all the manufacturing back, the trade deficit goes to zero, that would increase the overall share of our employment in the manufacturing sector as a percentage of our overall labor force by 2.5%, right? So going back just for a moment, that increases the number of manufacturing laborers back up to 10%, not back up to 25%. And I think that just needs to sink in. Just like if we started producing all of the tomatoes and avocados and strawberries that we eat in the United States, it wouldn't drive agricultural employment back up to 50% because we still would have combines and agribusiness, right? Similarly, even if we do all our manufacturing here, we're going to use a lot of robotics, right? And so the idea that if the Trump policies succeeded exactly in the way that they're envisioned, the fantasy turns out to be realized, well, that would raise wages for Americans as a whole, right? Average it across families by 1/3 of 1%. And to put it simply, right, the increase in costs of about $2,700 per family per year totally eclipse, swamp the marginal increase in wages from manufacturing coming back to our shores, which it's not actually going to do. Right. And so this policy is not going to work in the way that Trump and his advisors think it's going to work, according to, I think, almost every credible economist on this. And Krugman puts it, I think, quite nicely. He says, a tariff on labor-intensive imports can raise wages only if it leads to an expansion of labor-intensive production. And to be as clear as possible, right? Making shirts in Malaysia is labor-intensive. A lot of people are employed making shirts in Malaysia. If we start making shirts in the United States, it won't be labor intensive because our labor costs are expensive, right? And so it is economically efficient to create a robotic work factory in Los Angeles to make the shirts, but not in Malaysia to make the shirts. And then let me just add one more thing, right? I used Los Angeles advisedly, because Los Angeles is one of the few cities in the United States that actually still has sweatshops to make, right, the clothes we wear. And why does Los Angeles still have sweatshops? Because they have a high concentration of undocumented laborers, right? And the other thing the Trump administration is doing, of course, is trying to deport those workers, right? Going to their workplaces, going to their churches to try to round them up and get them out of the country. But the real effect of those policies is, frankly, to prevent new immigrants from wanting to come to the United States. So it's going to contract the labor force that might actually engage in manufacturing if these policies were to succeed. And so again, right, the policy just doesn't work in the way that the Trump administration thinks it's going to work. I now want to mix in the big beautiful bill, and I want to notice a few things that the big beautiful bill does. One of those things is to increase deficits, right? Probably to the tune of $500 billion a year for the next 10 years. By the way, when the government is competing, right? Because what increasing the deficit does is to make the government borrow money to fund the deficit. When the government is competing with everybody else for the limited amount of money that there is to borrow, that drives interest rates up. That increases inflation. So, all things equal, the big beautiful bill is almost certainly inflationary, but that's not the impact I want to focus on. The impact I want to focus on is that it's going to take what we call transfers away from people, right? And so our economy would be even more unequal if we didn't tax the rich more, tax the upper 20%, the upper 10% more. By the way, the upper 0.01% usually escapes its tax burden. There's some interesting reporting about Elon Musk and SpaceX on this, that he appears to be mainly dodging his tax burden. But having said that, right, that money is used in part not only to decrease the annual income of the very wealthy or the high earners, but to fund programs that make those who are in the bottom of the economic spectrum less poorly off than they would otherwise be. A really good example of this is Medicaid, right? Because if you don't have Medicaid, either you're less well off, you don't get the medicine, the health care that you need, or you have less money because you pay for insurance or you pay for your medical procedures, the ones you can't avoid out of pocket. By the way, a large portion of people will probably not get health insurance and not be able to pay for their necessary medical care. The healthcare system will have to eat those costs as losses because we don't refuse people care when they show up in the emergency room. And the result will be that middle class people will be paying more for health insurance and hospital care as a result of poor people no longer having Medicaid. But the bottom line number here, right, that apparently somewhere between 15 and 17 million people are going to lose health insurance. You add to that, right, that in order to fund tax cuts that go primarily to the most wealthy, and 80% of the benefit of the big beautiful bill in terms of its tax provision goes to the top 20% of our population. In order to fund that, they also drastically reduced the child tax credit and supplemental nutrition assistance for families. There are going to be more people who are hungry, especially more children who are hungry. A little bit of just background on this. Economists like to calculate how much the multiplier is for different government expenditures, right? $1 spent on food assistance to families with children results in roughly $3.50 more per dollar spent for our overall economy. How does that work? Well, poor people tend to spend their money directly on consumption, which stimulates economic growth, right? So they're buying food with their nutrition assistance that increases demand, increases overall economic growth. But in addition to that, when parents go to work knowing at the end of the day how they're going to feed their children, they concentrate on their jobs. They're not anxious, they're not distracted. Their bandwidth for doing the job is not constricted by their worry about, I don't know how I'm going to feed my kid at the end of the day. Will I make it to the food bank on time? Will they have food that my kids want to eat? No parent wants to have their children go to bed hungry, right? And that anxiety actually decreases their productivity at work, decreases the productivity of our economy. And then kids who go hungry are impacted by that. They're impacted physically and psychologically. They're less likely to do well in school. They're therefore less likely to do well in the job market and become people who, right, pull their own weight and contribute to the productivity of our economy, as opposed to becoming people who ultimately need government assistance or become long-term unemployed or criminals, right? And so in all of these regards, um, this is a policy that is purchasing benefits for the wealthiest among us by doing things that damage not only the poorest among us, but all of us. And so to synthesize, right, the black dots here represent the combined effect of the tariffs, which will cause inflation and make everybody pay more for the goods they're already consuming, and the one big beautiful bill, which will reduce government transfers in order to subsidize tax breaks primarily for the rich. As you can see, the net loss for the people at the bottom, 10% of our economy, 6.5% of their income per year, right? Go up a little bit, maybe it's 2 to 3%, 2%. It's not until you get to the top 20% that these policies combined have a neutral effect. And the only people who really benefit from these policies are in the top 10%. Trump ran as an anti-establishment candidate, ran on the idea that the system is rigged against ordinary working people. In government, what is he doing? He is doing exactly what Republicans have done for, right, the last 50 years at least, which is to pass policies that are very good for the wealthy and really bad for everybody else. And I think there is undoubtedly going to be anger and blowback against him as a result. As we know, the people who voted for him, the reason he won the presidency is because the people who make less and have less education moved into the Republican Party when Donald Trump was on the ballot. These are the people who believed that Donald Trump really understood their anger, their bitterness, their grievance, and was going to do something for them. They are going to be, I suspect, still more bitter. It doesn't mean that they're going to go back to the Democratic Party, but I do think it means at least that a substantial portion of them are likely not to vote in 2026, are likely to turn against Donald Trump, are likely to have a kind of plague on both of your houses' politics if the Democrats don't succeed in identifying both a plausible leader and policies that seem to address the concerns of the angry voters who feel left out of wealth creation. And so Donald Trump is going to have to manage that backlash, and I'm afraid of the way he's going to do it. But before I get into the politics, one more piece of the picture economically, and that's deportations, right? And so starting with an interesting study. It asks, what if we really got rid of all undocumented workers, right? What would that do to our economy? The suggestion is that it would shrink our economy by about 7.5%, that it would reduce the supply of laborers for key industries like, right, agriculture and construction. And please note, right, 1.5 million undocumented people working in construction, and that the result would be that it would push up prices by maybe 10%. Incredible inflation, right? Incredibly destructive inflation. And please note that for every 500,000 immigrants who are removed from the labor force, 44,000 American native-born workers lose their jobs as well, right? And to understand that, think about a construction site. We've got the idea that this is one of the places where undocumented people are employed in large numbers. What kind of work are they doing? Well, they're doing the least well-paid, least skilled, least attractive work, right? That they're, working nail guns in the hot sun, putting nails into boards. And if that work slows down as a result of deporting the workers who do it, or their unwillingness to show up to the job site because they fear being deported, well, then what happens? The people who do the drywalling, the people who are plumbers and electricians, the people who do the roofing, etc., the people who install kitchens aren't going to be able to work as quickly because they're going to have to slow the whole project down. Some of them are going to lose their jobs as well. By the way, this will cost Social Security $23 billion, cost Medicare $6 billion, because most of the people who are undocumented actually do pay these taxes and don't draw these benefits. So I now want to add a little bit of additional perspective on this and to note, and I think this is really important, really interesting, that the rate of deportations per month under Trump so far is slower than the average rate of deportations in the last year of Joe Biden's presidency, right? I hope I'm reading this data correctly, but I want to, say, even if, let's say, Donald Trump is deporting more people than Joe Biden was, it's not markedly more. What has changed is the optics of deportation. That what was a subtle operation going after criminals without a lot of fanfare has become a major show of force by this administration. Sweep into Los Angeles with the National Guard and the Marines, go through the big central parks, go into churches and courthouses and schools, separate parents from their children, separate spouses from each other, and then throw people into terrible detention facilities before deporting them, maybe not even to the country they're from, into an awful prison. What this says to people, its expressive dimension, is not just that you're not fully included in our society. That much is obvious. It's that we don't want you here. And by the way, people are getting the message loud and clear. Over the COVID recovery period, we were averaging over 70,000 people coming per month. We're down to 12,000 people trying to enter the country per month. That means our labor force is shrinking, right? That is going to impact inflation and productivity. And so again, right, just to be really clear about, right, the dynamics that draw immigrants to our country, right? And this includes the undocumented and the documented. Now, the people who come with authority, with permission. By the way, Trump is also trying to scale that back. That we have a shrinking labor force. and a growing economy. If you combine a shrinking labor force and a growing economy, either the economy stops growing, right, because you don't have the workers to employ, or alternatively, inflation increases because you have to pay higher wages to draw more people into the labor force. Migration has allowed us, and there's a very clear study from Goldman Sachs that shows, right, that the immigration has reduced inflation and increased economic growth measurably, maybe increased economic growth by as much as 2% since 2023, right? If we manage to really get immigration to go to zero, our population and our labor force shrink dramatically. Our economy is damaged, right? So we put all of this into the context of inequality in the United States. And here I'm going to be really fast, but please note how unequal we've become. Different ways of measuring this. The top 20% now account for 50% of the expenditure in our economy. The bottom 40% purchase only about 22%, 25%, call it, and the middle class purchase about 25%. This is not a healthy consumer economy where we're so dependent on the wealthy to purchase luxury goods, and average people, right, do not have sufficient resources to buy non-luxury goods. It's even more drastic when we move into, right, wealth disparities, right? And please note that the top 1% have $55 trillion in the American economy. It's almost half the world's wealth owned by 1% of Americans, and that the bottom 50% have almost no wealth at all, something like $400 per family in savings. That we're seeing lots of signs of economic stress as a result of this glaring inequality. Debt is high, right? And that's in part because it's just really hard to afford, for instance, childcare or mortgage or rents, all of which are up dramatically over the last 5 years. This is the complaint about inflation. Inflation is going to make this worse, which is going to increase our debt. And if the Fed has to increase interest rates, if investors lose confidence in the American economy, that's going to, right, increase the cost of this debt, the interest rates families are going to pay. Let me stop there. I want to continue speaking with you about inequality, but I do have a plane I have to catch as well, so I can come out and see you guys in person next week. So let me bring it all together, right? That, and I'll just very quickly share one last slide with you. Sorry to jump around like this, but that Donald Trump and his, I think, administration understand that what they're doing is not what their constituents want to do. I did want to speak with you in more detail about why we've become a more unequal society. I think I'm going to have to save that for another occasion. But again, I want to be as clear as possible. Loss of manufacturing jobs is one element of a much more complicated, involved picture that moves in several stages. And right, what I want to focus on, as opposed to the details of inequality right now, is what this is doing to Donald Trump, making him less popular, what he is doing in reaction, which is trying to gerrymander, what the Democrats are doing in reaction in California, as you're well aware, is trying to gerrymander back. I don't know what the prospects for success are. I think, frankly, it's going to be easier for the Republicans to succeed in gerrymandering than it will be for the Democrats. But please note, at the rally in which Gavin Newsom was announcing this plant, right? At a museum in Los Angeles, armed ICE agents showed up, not, right, to do an immigration sweep, just to show a force. We're here. We're watching. This administration has a large number of people, men mainly in body armor with guns, who are going to turn up and observe what the opposition is doing. Again, I think we are beginning to see the next phase in the autocratic playbook, which is to try to influence the outcome of the next election, in part by changing the rules of the game, in part by intimidating, disorganizing, suppressing the vote of the opposition. Let me stop there on another happy note. I know. Anybody have a thought, a question, a comment for today? Are you going to let me go catch my plane?
Yeah, have a safe trip.
Thank you, Anne. Appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you guys in person next week.
Yeah.
And we'll move on. We'll talk about a different topic. Okay. Be well and have good weeks. Thank you for accommodating me with the early start time this week. And I'll see you in person next week. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Fine.
Bye,
You,
guys.
David.
My pleasure as always. Thanks, guys. Bye bye.